Well, good morning. It is good to see you. It is good to be with you today. Good to worship with you. We have some who've been away at college back with us today. We're glad to see you. It's always good to see you. What a privilege it is to study God's Word together. We're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, if you'll turn over there with me if you haven't already. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. I mentioned to you a while back that we were going to have some discussions sprinkled in throughout the rest of this year regarding the Exodus, and today is one of those discussions. We'll be talking about the Exodus, but we'll be doing it in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And the reason we're doing that is because, well, it's there and it's really good information for us and helpful for us. So read with me now. We're going to stop short from where Blaze read. Read with me, though, beginning in verse 1 of 1 Corinthians chapter 10. The Apostle Paul says, "For I did not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and that rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not well pleased, for they were laid low in the wilderness." Verse 6. "Now these things happened as examples for us, so that we would not crave evil things as they also craved. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Nor let us act immorally, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in one day. Nor let us try the Lord, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the serpents. Nor grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come." Okay. You have the Exodus in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 because the Apostle Paul says those things that happened to them happened as examples for us. It's one of those little reminders that God is never doing just one thing at a time. He's always doing multiple things. He's always doing things that are helpful beyond their present circumstance. And so as He was delivering the Israelites from Egypt, He was also preparing material for you and me today. Isn't that an interesting thing? And it's good for us to remember that about God. So just a quick summary of what Paul says here about the Exodus. A quick summary begins with everybody involved received God's blessings. They all experienced God's blessings. That's what he talks about. And he begins by saying, I don't want you to forget about this. Look at verse 1 again. He says, "I don't want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea," and so on. They all experienced the blessings. He says the word all there in verse 1. He says it again in verse 2. He says it again in verse 3, again in verse 4. The idea is everybody that was a part of that experience enjoyed the blessings of God. God blessed the Israelites. All of them. Even the ones who weren't doing what they ought to do. Even the ones who didn't really believe. Even the ones who weren't 100% in. If they were there, they experienced God's blessings. God saw to that. Another thing about it is they failed to see and understand His blessings because they were focused on their present circumstances. Happened to them over and over and over again. Look back at your Bible. All of them experienced it, but in verse 5, nevertheless, with most of them, God was not well pleased. They all experienced the blessings, but they didn't all realize they were experiencing the blessings. We're going to stick to that theme as we go through it this morning, so hang on to that thought. They all experienced it, but they didn't all know they were experiencing it. They didn't see it the way God saw it. They were focused on their present circumstances instead of being focused on what God had for them. However, because they were focused on physical things, because they were focused on the journey and the troubles and the struggles and all of that that relates to their physical journey, because they were doing that, they ended up living physical lives. And that included immorality and idolatry and all of that. And they missed the promised land. Look back again at verse 5. With most of them God was not well pleased, for they were laid low in the wilderness. That is an interesting phrase. What that means is God killed them. We don't often say it that bluntly, but that's what that means. They didn't get to go to the promised land. They died in the wilderness because they were so focused on their circumstances and were unable to see what God was doing with them. Now, here's what's interesting for us. If I were to ask any of the young kids about the Exodus, they would know some things about that Exodus. If I were to ask them, why did the Exodus occur? They'd probably tell us because God wanted to take His people from Egypt to the promised land. They know that. That's what God was doing. From our perspective today, we look back at that event and we say, God was rescuing His people. We see what God was doing. He was rescuing the people He loved. But the people, while being rescued, didn't understand they were being rescued. All they saw was the circumstances. All they saw was the trouble. All they saw was the difficulty. And so because they were focused on their present situation, they missed out on the blessings of God. Caleb and Joshua of that generation got to go. The rest of them did not get to go. They died in the wilderness, never experiencing the promised land to which God was trying to lead them. You and I get that, don't we? We look back at the story and we say, okay, I understand that's how that went. I understand that that's what happened to them. What if, though? What if they had focused on God's deliverance instead? You ever thought about that? How would it have gone for them if they had focused on what God was doing with them instead of the things they were having to manage and overcome? What if they had changed their focus to, wait a minute, look at what's happening. We are out here in the wilderness. We are out here kind of in a bad situation. We are really not comfortable with all of this, but God's taken us to a better place. What if they had realized that? What if they had talked that way? What if that had been their self-talk and then their collective talk? God is rescuing us. It's hot out here today, and I fell 4 times over rocks I didn't see. I'm having a rough day, but God's taken me to the promised land. What if that had been their attitude? Well, we know the what if because of Caleb and Joshua. The what if would have been you get to go to the promised land. The what if is what God's trying to accomplish with you, He will accomplish with you. But they couldn't do it. They could not focus on God's deliverance, God's blessings, because they were, listen to me, so consumed with their present circumstance. And we get to verse 6, and he says, these things happened as an example for us. That's what Paul says in verse 6. And again, Paul says down in verse 11, these things happened as an example for us. What happened to them happened so you and I could learn the lesson better. Now, a couple of things about that. First of all, we have an obligation to learn the lesson better. But I don't want you to think they were in any way disadvantaged. We have their example so we can learn the lesson better, but they weren't at a disadvantage. They literally saw those miracles performed. They were there when the Red Sea parted. They saw that and experienced. They weren't at a disadvantage. But neither are we at a disadvantage. Even though I didn't see the Red Sea part like they did, I sure do get an account of how all of that went. And so the Apostle Paul is saying, we look at them and we learn some lessons from them. The reason it's really important for us to learn some lessons about it is because our situation is the same as their situation. We are tempted today to focus on the things that happen to us instead of the things that God is accomplishing for us. I want you to look at that on the screen and really take that in. So many times we order our lives, structure our lives based on the things that are happening to us instead of what God is trying to accomplish with us and for us. One of the blessings and curses we enjoy today is social media. And one of the blesses and curses of it is we get a glimpse into some people's lives through it. And you can see through social media things you wouldn't otherwise see in brief conversation with people. You can see how some folks, no matter what is happening, always are looking at the big picture of what God is trying to bring about in their lives and in the lives of those they love, and they keep moving forward, and they're just going to be okay. And you also see people that no matter what is happening, they will find the negative. They will find the disappointment. They will find the thing that just drags them down, the circumstances of life, and that's what they focus on, and you just about can't pull them up out of that. But that's not really what I want us to think about this morning. What I want us to think about is simply the fact that God was trying to take His people from where they were to where they needed to go, and they would not let Him do it because it was difficult, because they experienced some rough patches, because things were just simply unpleasant. They would not allow God to do it. Notice how Paul directs their attention. Go back in your Bible and look at what he says. He says in verse 1, I want you to be aware of this. What is it that we need to be aware of? That they all experienced these spiritual blessings. It wasn't just the physical side of deliverance, it was the spiritual side of it as well. They were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. You ever wondered what that's about? What does it mean to be baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea? Were they literally all lined up and then one at a time baptized into Moses? No, that's not what he means. What he's saying is when they submitted themselves to Moses and followed the cloud and went through the Red Sea, when they went through that process and submitted themselves to Moses, it is similar to what you and I do in baptism, submitting ourselves to Christ. They followed His leadership. They obeyed His voice. They did what He said to do. And when they did that, they enjoyed the blessings of God. God had set up Moses as their person to follow, His representative. Do what He says. When they did that, they got to cross the Red Sea on dry land. When they rebelled against Him, they were punished. It is the same thing with us and with Jesus. But he goes on, not only were they baptized into Moses, were they given a leader they could follow, but they ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink. That is to say, whatever their need was, God supplied it from a spiritual standpoint. Did He give them manna and water? Yes, but He gave them what they needed from a spiritual standpoint as well. And then he summarizes the fact that Christ was that spiritual rock. The point of all of that, you ever thought about that? The point of the Exodus ultimately was Christ. We don't think that way a lot of times. We think that the point of it was literally to take them to the promised land. That was the case, but all of that, every bit of that, was a type or an example of how you and I come to Christ. Deliverance from bondage to sin. And it's a struggle. And our journey from where we were to where we need to go is not always going to be easy. It's going to be lonely sometimes and uncomfortable. It's going to require us to do things we don't want to do. But if we'll follow that cloud, if we'll follow Moses or Christ for us, if we'll do the things we're supposed to do, it'll work out. Paul directs them back to spiritual concerns, not the physical concerns. God took care of their physical concerns, but that's not the thing Paul brings up. Paul says, look at things from a spiritual perspective. So their job, if we could say this, what was their job? What was the Israelites' job during this time? What would we say? Well, their job was to go to the promised land. That was their job, right? That's what they're supposed to be doing. From Egypt to the promised land. That's their job. What is our job today? What is our job? What's your job? It's exactly the same. Your job is to go to the promised land and then take as many people with you as you can. Your job is to do that. That is your focus. That is the thing. So the question for us is, are we going to let the circumstances of life get in the way? Are we going to let things cause us problems? Are we going to let situations derail us? Are we going to do that? We have to get to a point, ladies and gentlemen, we have to get to a point to where we never let the things of this world determine how we relate to the Creator of this world. Read that again. We're not going to let the things of this world determine how we relate to the Creator of this world. They did that, and we have their information as an example, so we won't do that. It's really important for us to think in terms of, why am I here and what am I trying to accomplish? Because what Satan wants you to do, listen to me, he wants you to focus on your everyday situations and the circumstances that you don't like and the things that make you uncomfortable and the things that disappoint you and even the things that break your heart. And if he can get you to focus on those things, then you're not thinking about God and what God's trying to do for you. And he wins. Satan wins the day. I've told some of you before, I think, in a sermon, I try not to mention it often, but I think I've told you that the greatest disappointment that I experienced in my life, not to this point, but to the point, was when my mom passed away. I was about 23 years old when she got sick, 28 when she died. And to that point, that was the biggest disappointment I'd ever experienced. That was the hardest thing I'd ever had to endure. There may have been other things I had to endure up to that point, but I wasn't mature enough to realize it or whatever. But that was a difficult thing. The thing that made that hard, and I know all of you in some way can relate to this, I'm certainly no exception. Everybody can relate to this. The thing that made that really hard is I had zero control over that situation. None. And I don't know how you are, but I don't like situations where I have no control. I just don't like it. At all. I love live music. I like concerts, don't like crowds. That's a problem. That's a real problem. There's a lot of concerts I'd like to go to, but there are people there. If we could get rid of all those people, I'm in. My wife's the exact same way. I like to be in control. When my mom was sick, I had zero control. None. Others of you have been through that. You know that feeling. It is in moments like that where Satan wants you to focus on the situation and the circumstances. He wants you to focus on the disappointment, the sadness, the grief, the loneliness. That's what he wants you to do. And he will use those things to try to get you to do that. Since that time in my life, at age 28, other things have happened. Disappointments. Things that are just so unmanageable and unfixable and so sad. And I can't do anything about it. Not one thing. Can you relate to that? That's what life is. It wasn't that when God put Adam and Eve in the garden, that was perfect. But when sin entered into the world, that's what life became. And for all of us, somehow, some way, it's just going to be that. And some, I suppose, get out without too much. But a lot of folks just have to endure it. And I've had people say, what do I do? What do I do about this situation? How do I fix this? I don't know. I do not know. There are situations about which I literally grieve every day and I cannot fix it. I do not know how to fix it. There is no solution to it. But you know what? That's not what I'm going to focus on. That's not what is going to regulate my behavior on a daily basis. And that is certainly not what is going to regulate my relationship with the Creator. We cannot do that, because if we do that, we will end up like they ended up. Go back in your Bible and read it one more time to verse 5. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not well pleased, for they were laid low in the wilderness. The Hebrew writer said it like this in chapter 4. The Hebrew writer said, God said, they shall not enter my rest. That's God saying, you don't trust in me enough? You don't believe in me enough? You're not getting the promised land. What I want you to understand, ladies and gentlemen, is there are times in our lives when we are tempted to give up on God one way or another. We wouldn't say it like that, but we just kind of ease up from the spiritual things. We just back away from doing what's right. We'd like to do what's right, but life isn't easy right now, so I'm going to pull back from God. Satan loves it, because what that is exactly what these folks were doing. And we know what happened to them. We have an account of that as an example. So the one thing we don't do, the one thing we will not do, is we will not quit. Hold on just a minute. We say it like that sometimes. In preaching, sometimes we say it like that. The ideal position, the ideal attitude to have is, we will not quit. And so we say that. We say, we will not quit. When we know that there are some folks among us who are in the process of quitting. We know that. We know there are some people who are in the process of drawing away from God instead of drawing closer to God. There are some who are in the process of missing the promised land if you don't change. And so we say it from an ideal standpoint. We say, we will not quit because, well, that's our position. We won't quit, even though some of you want to quit sometimes. What I'm telling you this morning is, two different times in the context, the Apostle Paul, inspired of God, says, here's an example for you. Don't quit. You cannot stop serving the Creator because of circumstances in this world. It is a completely illogical thing for any of us to do. You don't pull away from the one who wants to rescue you right when you need to be rescued. But that's what they did. And that's what some of us will do if we don't get serious about serving God and His people. What is our job again? To go to the promised land. It is not to have a happy life. It is not to have all kinds of neat things. It is not to enjoy ourselves. Our job is to go to the promised land, just like their job was. Well, what all they have to endure to get to the promised land? Does it matter what they had to endure? Once you're in the promised land, you don't care what you had to endure. Sometimes we just have to toughen up. That's what they needed to do. That's what we need to do. So, that took us down through verse 11, right? Blaze read for us verse 13. We're going to pick up in verse 12 and wrap up that section, because verse 13 is one of those verses that I'm afraid we've done a disservice to many, many times in our understanding of it or the way we apply the verse. Verse 13 is stated as a cap on what we've already looked at, what we've already talked about. Okay? Verse 13 is not a statement made without any connection to the previous verses. So verse 12, he says, since all of that example business is there for us, verse 12, therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed that he does not fall. Well, what that's saying is what we just said. Okay? Be careful. And don't say I'm a Christian, everything's okay if you're not being a Christian. Don't say, I'm going to be all right if you're not being all right. If you're not serving God and His people to the very best of your ability, don't act like you are. If you happen by the church building once or twice a month, don't act like you're serving the Lord and the Lord's people. Be real about it. Be serious about it. Be committed to His cause, because Satan's after you. That's the thing. He doesn't want you to get to the promised land. So don't act like everything's fine if everything's not fine. If you're not headed to the promised land, make a change. Verse 12. Now verse 13. Be helpful if you look at it in your Bible. Verse 13. No temptation has overtaken you, but such as is common to man. And God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able, but with the temptation will provide the way of escape also, so that you will be able to endure it. Oh, sometimes we say, God won't give you more than you can handle. You ever heard anybody say that? I'm afraid I probably said that in my lifetime as well. God won't give you more than you can handle. Yes, He will. Yes, He will. Did the Israelites have more than they could handle with 430 years of bondage to the Egyptians? Was that more than they could handle, or were they able to handle that just fine? They were not able to handle that. They could not rescue themselves. You know, some Israelites were born, lived, and died in Egypt, never seeing the promise of God fulfilled. Have no idea during their lives that God's going to deliver His people. They were in a circumstance they could not manage, just like you and I will be from time to time. Don't say God will never give you more than you can handle. He will allow you to suffer things that you cannot manage yourself. He will do that. James talks about that. When we are struggling with the difficulties of life and the challenges of life, ask God who gives you wisdom in those moments. There will be things that you can't figure out for yourself and you can't overcome by yourself. You need to count on God. Well, if the verse isn't saying God won't give you more than you can handle, what is it saying? And what is it saying in connection to what He has already said in verses 1 through 12? What it's saying is, God will make it so you can keep going. You may be in a terrible circumstance. Life's circumstances might hurt. It might be painful for you every day. You might spend a lot of time crying about the situation, understanding you can't fix it. You just can't do anything about it. That's fine. That's okay. But understand what God is willing to do. He is willing to help you keep going. What is the way of escape that He talks about in verse 13? You ever thought about that? Look back at it. What is the way of escape? Well, the way to answer that is to ask this question. What would have been the way of escape for those Israelites who fell in the wilderness? God laid them low, it says in verse 5 in the wilderness. What would have been the way of escape for them? Think about that for a minute. What would have been the way of escape from the temptation they were faced with in the wilderness? What is the only way of escape for them? What was the only thing they could do? Keep following Moses in the cloud. Keep going. That's all they could do. That's all the Israelites could do. They didn't chart the course. They didn't set the schedule. They weren't the ones who decided what we're having for supper. They were the ones who simply were supposed to go to the promised land. And if you're having trouble, if life is terrible, if you are disappointed, if you are sad, if things just are not the way you thought they would be, all I know to say is, the way of escape is to keep going to the promised land. The temptation he talks about is what he references in verses 6 through 10. Look at what he says there. They craved evil things. They were idolaters. They acted immorally. They tested God and they complained. That's what we do when things aren't going our way. That's what we do. What was the way of escape for them? Keep moving toward the promised land. Follow your leader. Keep doing today's work today. You will never go wrong as a Christian if you do the work you're supposed to do when you're supposed to do it. But when you see yourself not doing the work that you are supposed to do for His cause and His people, you know that Satan has snuck in there. These things are written for our example. The way of escape for you and me is the same for them. You keep going. Look back at verse 13. God is faithful. That doesn't mean that God is going to remove every issue, every challenge, every disappointment, that God's going to make everything peachy and rosy and everything's going to be happy. It's not what that means. It means God is faithful and He's going to take the people who want to go to the promised land to the promised land. He's going to do that. Just like He did with Caleb and Joshua. He's going to do that. God is faithful in this journey, in this process. He's going to do what He said He was going to do. Our task is to go along with Him. It's to do our part today so we can go to the promised land. That is the way of escape. And when we are doing that, listen, this is the end of it. This is the end, so stay with me. When we are doing that, no temptation will be able to overtake you. You get that? Look back at verse 13. God is faithful, will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able. But with the temptation will provide a way of escape so that you will be able to endure it. You keep taking that way of escape, keep taking that step toward the promised land every day, doing your job as a Christian. And by His grace, He'll make it all okay. Sometimes we have to get comfortable with the fact that it's not our job to fix every problem that comes along. Even if that problem is very personal, even if that problem hurts badly, it is not our job to fix every problem. It is our job to follow Christ, just like it was their job to follow Moses. It is our job to do our work today, and then by His grace, He makes it all okay. I may not understand how all that works. I don't and don't have to. That's all right. We don't quit. We keep going because the promised land is still out there. If you realize you've kind of slacked off and you and your family have not been committed to the Lord's cause as you ought, these things are written as an example for us. Look at that example. Commit to the Lord and His people and keep heading for the promised land. If we can help you in any way, you let us know while we stand and sing.